He kōna I purangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Kia ora, I'm William Ray. Welcome to Black Sheep. A few weeks ago, I took a trip up from Wellington to New Plymouth. One of my best mates lives up there. His name's Sam, and he and his partner Annie are having a baby soon, so I wanted to head up and say congrats. We grabbed dinner at a place called the Snug Lounge. It's sort of like a fancy food court with a bunch of restaurants and bars surrounding a central covered courtyard. Here we are approaching the Snug Lounge from Devon Street, or the Hart Hotel, as it was once. I've got my local Sam here with me. Sam, any thoughts?
No thoughts coming to mind, William.
Okay, all right. I should admit I had an ulterior motive coming to New Plymouth. There's a fantastic black sheep who came out of this town, and the building which now hosts the Snug Lounge was a big part of his story. I was hoping some of the staff would know all about it and could regale me with anecdotes over a few beers. So I'm coming to town today because this building in 1890 was the site of quite a famous attempted robbery. Have you heard anything about that?
No.
Some teenager had been going around robbing people in town dressed up as a highwayman for 15 months, and he just busts in here, pulled a gun on the owner of the hotel and said, like, bail up.
I've never heard the story, to be honest, yeah.
Do you know if anyone here knows anything about that?
Unfortunately not, yeah. Not at this time of day, anyway.
It is. So, it turned out nobody working at the Snug Lounge that night knew this story. I was a bit surprised, but then again, this robbery happened more than 100 years ago, and the building's literally a shell of its former self. Back in 1893, the Snug Lounge was known as the White Hart Hotel. The elaborate 19th century facade of the White Hart's still there, but the interior's mostly been demolished and renovated. You can just barely work out what happened where by looking at the old floor plan hanging on the wall.
There you go.
That would have been the original, yeah. That's crazy. Back in 1893, the White Hart Hotel hold-up and the 15-month-long crime spree which surrounded it captivated the whole country, but especially New Plymouth. Frankly, it would be a tragedy if this yarn of highway robbery was ever lost to history. So, for the benefit of the staff of the Snug Lounge, as well as regular listeners of Black Sheep, this is the story of Robert Wallath, the teenage highwayman of New Plymouth.
The thing I can't understand about it is how no one recognised him.
Yeah.
The official numbers in New Plymouth in that 1893 year were recorded as 3,350 Pākehā people living in the town and around. That's not very many to...
You would think that people would recognise his voice even though he's masked, right?
His height, his build, his general age, you'd think there'd be a few things standing out.
This is Megan Wells. She's a historian at Pukeariki Museum. I went to visit Megan earlier in the day so she could fill me in on Robert Wallath.
It is a really popular story. It pops up all over the place. I think even Shining Peak, one of our local breweries, have put Robert Wallath's photo on the outside of one of their beer cans.
It feels like people love this story almost even while the crimes are being committed. Like it's such a fascinating and fantastic yarn.
That's one of the bits I've been trying to untangle, is how much of it was the story being created even at the time, because people enjoyed the notoriety of Robert Wallath and what he stood for.
Our story begins with Robert Wallath's parents. They came to New Zealand from Germany via Australia in the 1870s. Robert himself was actually born at sea en route to their new home. When Robert was 5, his parents bought a farm near New Plymouth in Westtown. The track which once led to their house is still named Wallath Road, And it's Wallath with a TH, by the way, not Wallace with a C. Robert's dad, Herman Wallath, was a talented and respected carpenter, and he taught his son the trade. But as he arrived in his early teens, Robert had a difficult patch.
His father describes him as a challenging teenager. He would keep the door of his room locked and threaten to blow the heads off his family members if they stepped into his room. He was the eldest of, I think, 6 children. And his parents, they didn't know what to do with him. According to the newspapers, they did take medical advice, and the medical advice was, let him be, he'll grow out of it.
Robert also acted out in a way that might seem a bit tame by today's standards. He joined the Salvation Army. This is where Robert himself begins his story in the memoir he wrote about his life. It's called A Highwayman with a Mission, which is a bit of a confusing read. After all, it was written more than 60 years after the event, when Robert was in his 70s. Apparently, also, Robert couldn't decide whether to write in the first or third person because it changes randomly back and forth between paragraphs. But anyway, he starts off in the third person.
It was in the year of 1886 that, being a lad of about 12 years, and in the days when the Salvation Army were all blood and fire, and much mocked and made fun of by many who knew no better, he was first called to one of their meetings. Although the lad scarcely knew the meaning of it, it left him filled with the spirit that longed to serve his then unknown God. But his father was very much against his joining the Salvation Army, so the lad kept these things in his own heart.
According to Robert, his dad never attended church and was sceptical of religion, so you can see why he might not approve of his kid joining a blood and fire evangelical movement with a somewhat militant flavour. Anyway, fast forward 4 years to 1890. It's a summer's day, and we find a religiously frustrated 16-year-old Robert Wallath working alone on the family farm, cutting a track. But when he laid down on the grass to take a break, he suddenly felt dizzy. Robert wrote in his book that he fell into a daze and prayed to be drawn in deeper, feeling a profound power enfolding him. He also switches to writing in the first person, just by the way.
This wondrous power surrounded me instantaneously. But although the Holy Spirit strove with my soul, yet in the hardiness of my heart and of my own self-will, I rejected that holy power.
Robert says that over the next few days, he became increasingly disillusioned.
I was fast becoming an atheist and free thinker, looking upon honour and truth as excellent things indeed, and forming a scale of morals for myself to be observed, instead of worshipping God or serving Him in any way.
Then, lying in bed one night, Robert said he had another religious experience.
About midnight, I had a dream, yea, it was a vision and true, wherein I saw first that I should spend the early part of my life in seeking to become, and in becoming, a criminal of honourable degree.
Robert describes seeing a brilliant white mansion set in a beautiful garden. There was a chorus of angels. Then he heard a voice.
My guide said This is the interpretation of the vision. Thou having walked in all manner of crime and evil in thy youth, it shall be that when thou art come into manhood, thou shalt, by the Spirit of God's grace, turn and repent thee, and by his grace overcome evil.
Now, you nasty skeptics out there listening to this might be thinking this stuff sounds a little bit suspicious. You know, Satan made me do it is a good get-out-of-jail-free card for a guilty conscience. But interestingly enough, there is evidence this vision or dream or whatever did actually happen. Robert's dad told the newspapers about it at the time his son was arrested. Although Herman Wallath wasn't so convinced that Robert was possessed by the Holy Spirit.
Mr. Wallath says that some 18 months ago, Robert was poisoned by something he had taken while harvesting. Dr. Leatham came to that conclusion when he saw him. Since that time, Mr. Wallath states that his son became worse in his temper.
Later on, Robert Wallath's lawyer would say that he suffered epileptic fits and, quote, brain fever after this event. Anyway, these visions sound a bit unusual. Possibly they hint at some kind of mental or neurological illness. Possibly he got some fumes inhaled, or he got heat stroke, or just maybe none of the above. Robert Wallath is far from the only teenager to suddenly find religion and feel it in a very intense way. And although he shouted and screamed at his parents, the wider community thought Robert was a promising young man. He was the sub-editor of a journal published by the Westtown Mutual Improvement Society. He also became a member of the Taranaki Rifle Volunteers. But then, on Easter Monday of 1892, the trouble started. Here's how it was reported in the Taranaki Herald.
A rather sensational case of sticking up has been reported to the police, who are now investigating the matter. It appears that on Monday evening, about 5:30, Mr. Henry Jordan, a settler on the Carrington Road, left town, where he had been attending the sports, to ride home. He was proceeding along the Carrington Road when, at a spot about 15 miles from town, a horseman rode out from the side of a hedge and called out, "Halt! I demand your money or I'll put a bullet through your brains," at the same time presenting a revolver at Mr. Jordan. The man wore a mask and was dressed in a red coat and wore a small, round, tight-fitting cap. At his side he carried a sword and a revolver in his belt.
I think the reaction was a bit of a giggle to start with, but he did hand over his money.
Yeah.
And the highwayman carried on his way.
And he's dressed ludicrously, this guy.
Yeah, he's picked up some military uniform. He's got his red jacket on. He's got his dark trousers, silver stripes down the side. He's got his officer's sword, his revolver, his spears, a mask over his face.
And you can see why you would treat this as a joke. Like, if someone jumped out at you in the street like this today, you would absolutely go, okay, this person is having a bit of fun, right?
Yeah, definitely. And New Plymouth was pretty small around there. I guess everyone would have known everyone, and nobody would have been expecting that.
In fact, Henry Jordan seems to have thought the whole thing was so ludicrous that he didn't even report the robbery to the police. And even when it was reported by a neighbour, the police didn't take it seriously either.
The police think that the perpetrator of the outrage, in view of the dramatic manner in which it was carried out, was indulging in what he thought was a joke.
But then, in early July 1892, the highwayman struck again.
A highway robbery occurred last night at Ormata, 3 miles from New Plymouth. The toll gate keeper there was stuck up, and £5 in silver taken.
£5 wasn't a small amount of money, by the way. That'd be more than $900 in today's money.
The highwayman was dressed in an officer's tunic and carried a sword and revolver. He went into the tollgate house at 8 p.m. and, presenting a revolver within 18 inches of the tollgate keeper's head, demanded money.
Then, in late September, there was a third robbery.
A Stratford man tells the Egmont settler that whilst riding quietly along the mountain road on Wednesday last, he was overtaken by a man on a grey horse. He pulled up close to Mr. Murray and, presenting a revolver at him, said, "Your money or your life."
The police investigated all three cases, but there was a bit of scepticism. Officers wondered if maybe they were being hoaxed. But in late October, things stepped up a notch. The Highwayman held up 3 men in succession in a single night. And this time, there were dozens of witnesses.
The fourth case of highway robbery within the last 2 or 3 months occurred on Saturday night at about 9 o'clock. A man named Carthew was leading a horse in the suburbs, about 10 minutes' walk from the centre of town, when a man on horseback, dressed in an officer's uniform with a sword and revolver, rode up to him and demanded his money and jewellery. He gave up his watch and 3 threepenny pieces, all the money he had on him, and the highwayman rode on towards town. A few minutes after, the highwayman bailed up another man named Billy, who said he was a poor man and had no money. The highwayman said, "Pass on, I don't want to rob a poor man." Growing bolder, the highwayman rode into the town and stuck up another man in front of a grocer's shop with 20 or 30 people around. This man also said he had no money and was not molested. The highwayman remained for about a minute, coolly looking at the people, and then rode off. He was pursued by a man on horseback, but escaped.
The next day, 300 people crowded in front of the Criterion Hotel to hear the story from a witness. As the Taranaki Herald reported, nobody thought it was a hoax anymore.
On previous occasions when the man has robbed people, there has been a doubt thrown on the matter, and many were inclined to believe that the red-coated highwayman was a myth. But by his daring exploit on Saturday night, it leaves it no longer in doubt that a man is abroad in a masquerading dress who bails up people at night for the purpose of robbing them. Whoever the individual may be, it is time his pranks were stopped. For whilst he is at large, there will naturally exist a feeling of insecurity on the part of persons having to be out at night.
But while the Taranaki Herald took an anxious tone, others, like the editor of the Catholic Times, were still treating the whole thing as a joke.
Someone up Taranaki way is bringing the glorious profession of highwayman into disrepute. He bailed up 3 men in one night and succeeded in extracting only 9pence and a damaged pocket watch from the crowd. Yet the highwayman carried both revolver and sword. Why, a Salvation Army lass equipped with a banjo would have done better.
The highwayman continued to strike again and again through late 1892 and into 1893, about once every month or so. He'd ride up out of nowhere dressed in his bizarre uniform with a pair of revolvers and a sword. He'd demand money and then vanish off into the dark. In his book, Robert explained he'd usually borrow a horse he found tied up somewhere rather than use his own horse, which could be easily identified. But aside from that robbery of the Ormata tollgate, he usually didn't get much. A bit of loose change, a pocket watch, some jewellery. Occasionally, when his victims pled poverty, he just rode off empty-handed. Unfortunately, it's a bit tricky to tell how many of these reported hold-ups were actually committed by Robert Wallath. For one thing, and here's an unexpected twist, there were at least 2 copycat highwaymen. In May of 1893, a man named Charles Thomas was arrested after bursting out of the bushes to grab the bridle of a man's horse, shouting, "I am the highwayman!" But the robberies continued after he was locked up. In June of 1892, another young bloke in Inglewood decided to dress up as a highwayman and pretend to rob one of his mates as a joke. As the Taranaki Herald reported, that didn't go so well.
The playful disciple of Ned Kelly was greatly surprised to find that his man, instead of standing passively like a lamb, slipped off his horse and, speaking in the common but expressive parlance of the day, went for him. Being thus tackled, the young fellow forgot all about his character of highwayman and responded to the challenge right merrily. The fight was continued till considerable facial damage was affected. Mutual explanations were finally made, and the pair went home, the practical joker being a sadder but wiser man.
Sometimes innocent people were caught up in the excitement. In early November of 1892, a traveller passing through town was dragged from his horse by a pair of vigilantes who suspected him of being the highwayman.
The captured man was evidently under the impression that he too had fallen among robbers, for he was terribly scared. When he arose from the ground, he piteously asked what he had done to merit such treatment.
The cops were constantly being called out to deal with sightings, real or imagined. Around the same time that poor guy got dragged off his horse, 2 10-year-old girls reported being held up by the highwayman. It turned out they just got scared by a local man who bumped into them accidentally.
False reports as to the doings of the robber are still rife, and his exploits are terribly exaggerated by some persons. For instance, some reports give him credit for sticking up fully half a dozen persons on Saturday night, whereas he had only paid attention to 3.
Even so, all the way through 1893, the highwaymen continued to strike. As well as the overt highway robberies, there were also a number of covert burglaries, which Robert Wallath would later admit to. Historian Megan Wells particularly likes one story where Robert drilled through the door of a grocery shop to break the lock and made off with several boxes of cigars.
And the next day, they came to see his father as the local carpenter to come and repair the door. So he sent Robert over, and it was Robert himself that was repairing the door. So I feel like there was a sense of humour that Robert had, that he actually enjoyed this. He enjoyed being the one to put the door back on.
But the best fun Robert Wallath had on his crime spree was his robbery of the Snug Lounge, or as it was known back in February 11th, 1893, the White Hart Hotel.
A sensation was caused at 11:15 last night by the sudden appearance of a highwayman. He entered the White Hart Hotel, Devon Street, opposite the government buildings, and presented a revolver at the barman. He opened the inner door and took 15 shillings and a bottle of whiskey and deliberately marched out, his sword clanging in the passage as he went. There were 18 persons in the house at the time, and the highwayman was in the hotel 5 minutes, yet he got off without interruption. The police, with Inspector Thompson, went in pursuit and kept up the search all night without effecting his capture, though they found the bottle of whiskey.
The police also found one of the highwayman's pistols. It slipped off his belt while he was riding away and went off with a bang. What Inspector Thompson and his men didn't know is that as they were combing the town, the highwayman had ditched his disguise in some nearby bushes and returned to the scene of the crime. Robert Wallath tells the story in his autobiography, and he's back in the third person here, just by the way.
He reins up his Neddy and inquires if anything is the matter. A chorus of voices proceed to enlighten him, saying the highwayman had just held this hotel up and has only just departed. "Nonsense," answers the astonished rogue. "You mean to tell me he has been here?" "Yes, it is a fact. Didn't you hear the shot a few minutes ago?" So, after a few minutes more of excited information, he bids them goodbye, for he knows quite a few of them well, and they, as a parting salute, call out, "You'd better look out for him, or you might meet him on the road."
In fact, Robert had so much fun robbing the White Hart Hotel that a few months later, he decided to hit another hotel just down the road. But this was where our black sheep finally met his match. The Criterion Hotel, 20 July 1893, 10:30 p.m. The hotel's commercial room was full of men talking and drinking. The hotel keeper, Mrs. Mary Cottier, was behind the bar next to the front door. A few other men and staff were in the billiard room down a dimly lit corridor. Robert Wallath burst in the door. He was dressed head to toe in his highwayman's outfit. Feather-plumed hat, red jacket, striped trousers and mask, not to mention a fake beard. In his right hand was a revolver. Another gun was holstered at his side, next to that long cavalry sword of his. He charged up to the bar and pointed his gun at Mary Cottier's face.
"Bail up! Pass the money from the till."
There was instant pandemonium. Mary Cottier later recalled that nobody came to help her, and in fact, 2 men in the commercial room got stuck trying to escape through the same window. Mrs. Cottier seems to have thought the whole thing was a joke at first. She basically told the masked man to bugger off, and he, seemingly a little put off by this, turned and walked down the corridor towards the billiard room. Then Mrs. Cottier rushed out from behind the bar and ran down the darkened corridor. She found the highwayman pinned to the ground by 2 men. A third man was beating him around the shins with a thick wooden stick. The highwayman's mask was pulled aside, but at first it was too dark to make out his face.
That's young Wallath.
The exact details of Robert Wallath's capture are kind of confused. Witnesses tell slightly different stories. It seems Robert rounded a corner and found himself face to face with Harold Thompson, son of the local police inspector, who, in the parlance of the day, went for him. Harold took Robert down in a flying tackle. The highwayman was knocked to the floor and cracked his head. Another pair of men rushed in to help pin him down. But at some point in all this drama, the gun in Robert's hand went off. It was pointed right at Harold Thompson's chest. Harold got extremely lucky. The bullet bounced off a rib, and apparently that was thanks to an assortment of objects which are now in the collection of Pukeariki Museum. A perforated silk handkerchief, a chipped metal whistle, and a dented tobacco tin. These apparently blunted the impact of Robert Wallath's bullet. But Megan Wells is a little sceptical.
The tobacco tin is such a curious one because the official story that's sitting there with it is it belonged to Robert Wallath.
Oh, yeah.
And it's got the dent in the front, and the dent in the front is from where the bullet hit, which makes absolutely no sense unless it belonged to Harold Thompson on that day and then went to... So there's a bit of a license for keeping the story going, I think.
And then you've also got this police whistle here. And what's the story behind this?
The police whistle supposedly was in the pocket of Harold Thompson. Supposedly that one's got a nick on it from the same bullet as it went past the police whistle. It seems like a strange thing that somebody would be carrying a police whistle, but his father was the police inspector. So Possibly, not sure.
And what are these other objects that we have here?
Well, we've got a third bullet.
Really?
Going through the handkerchief over here,
Yeah.
which is meant to be Harold Thompson's handkerchief. And that one is possibly the most likely that came into contact with the bullet, possibly.
Because this was actually presented at trial, right? They showed all the clothing and like scorch marks and bullet holes and stuff.
Yeah, but no police whistles and no tobacco tins.
So you can hear Megan and I laughing at this somewhat ridiculous image of bullets miraculously bouncing off various items in different people's pockets. But this story did become a tiny bit more believable when I read the gunsmith's report, which was presented at trial. Back in those days, ammunition didn't often come pre-made. You usually had to assemble it yourself. And Robert Wallath's gun was, in the words of the gunsmith, very roughly loaded. Each chamber of the revolver was loaded not just with bullets and gunpowder, but also shotgun pellets. In fact, the gunsmith said the revolver was so overstuffed that some bullets appeared to have been literally hammered into the chamber as far as they would go, then the excess hacked off with a saw. The smith noted that the gun was, and I quote, at much risk of exploding, and he, quote, would not test fire it for a sovereign. So maybe it is possible the different bits of bullets and pellets went flying all over the place and hit different things, like that police whistle and tobacco tin. Anyway, Robert Wallath got very lucky. The gun didn't explode, and the shot he fired caused a relatively minor wound.
He stuck by the fact that he never meant to shoot anyone. Sounds like a kid who's in over his depth and it's gone out of control.
Yeah. Where did he get the guns from? Do we know?
Well, I assume that at that point in time they were readily available. It was something that people had in their general family homes, and one of the local providers had claimed that in that 15-month period that the sales had gone up through the roof, implying, of course, that people were feeling like they needed to have them at home to protect themselves from the Highwayman, but that's up for debate as well.
Because it is, all along you get this sort of tricky question of how seriously people are actually taking any of this. Like, they seem on one hand to be taking it seriously, on the other hand they don't seem to be worried at all.
No, and everything keeps contradicting itself. The understanding that people were getting more and more concerned and more worried, yet the fact that they kept laughing.
Yeah.
And they kept being recorded as laughing. The fact that he's making jokes in the courtroom and everyone's laughing at his jokes.
We'll get to that court case in a minute, but after his capture, Robert Wallath was immediately dragged off to the cells. Harold Thompson quickly recovered from his wound and was bathed in local admiration for his heroic capture of the Highwayman. His dad even got a letter of appreciation from Prime Minister Richard Seddon. The day after Robert's capture, the Taranaki Herald tracked down his dad Herman and interviewed him about his suddenly notorious son.
On Friday morning, Mr. Wallath knocked at his son's room to awake him, but receiving no replies to his knocks, he opened the window and went in, when he was startled to discover that his son had not slept in the bed. In further search, Mr. Wallath discovered that the horse and saddle were missing. Mr. Wallath now became thoroughly alarmed and hurried to the police station, where he was staggered to learn that his son had been arrested as the Highwayman. The police went to his house on Friday morning and searched his son's room.
Inside Robert's room, police found boxes of cigars and a few other bits and pieces he'd stolen over the past 15 months. They also found a bunch of romantic paperback novels about highwaymen and bushrangers, people like Ned Kelly, Gentleman George, Dick Turpin. It was pretty clear where Robert got his inspiration from. On July 28th, about a week after his capture, Robert Wallath made his first public appearance at the Magistrates' Court.
There was a continual hum of conversation going on among the spectators until Robert Wallath and his escort appeared on the scene, when a breathless silence prevailed, all eyes being turned on the figure of the man who has created so much interest during the last few days. The number of spectators present in the courthouse was variously estimated, but anyone would have been well within the mark by fixing the number at 500.
Remember, at this point, New Plymouth is a town of just over 3,000 people. So that means about 1 in 6 residents turned up to watch this case. By the second day, the court was so full that the magistrate had to ask the police to hunt through the crowd and turf out all the young boys who'd come to watch.
Sergeant Duffin then began a boy hunt and eventually succeeded in turning some 30 lads out of the room. The lads, who had been looking at Robert Wallath with fixed attention, showed a decided reluctance to leave.
And honestly, who could blame them? Robert Wallath was the best show in town. He blew kisses and waved as he was brought to and from the cells in the police wagon. At one point, he nicked a constable's helmet and put it on his head as a joke. Later, when he was asked if he had any questions for a witness who accused him of stealing cigars, Robert just asked if he could have one of the cigars now to smoke in the dock. Writing in his autobiography, Robert said he behaved this way because he was under the influence of Satan. Possibly, he was also under the influence of being a 20-year-old idiot who didn't fully appreciate how much trouble he was in. Robert didn't take any of it very seriously. He didn't ask many questions of witnesses or make any statement in his own defence. He mostly just sat there, smirking at the crowd, sometimes chatting with the police officers.
Before the court opened for business this Monday morning, the highwayman, Robert Wallath, began a conversation with Constable Roche, which was audible to those standing near the dock. Wallath wanted to show Constable Roche how easily he could escape from the guardians of the law. You see, he said, I could jump out of here, knock you down, and run down the stairs, and jump into a cab, and get away before you could catch me.
The magistrate's court found there was a prima facie case against Robert Wallath for inflicting grievous bodily harm and multiple counts of robbery. He was committed to appear before the Supreme Court the next time it sat in New Plymouth. And on August 8th, while he was awaiting trial, Robert Wallath put his boasts about escaping to the test. At about 10:30 that morning, he was sitting in the exercise yard at New Plymouth Jail. His eyes were closed, seemingly dozing. But then, when the jailer was distracted, Robert leapt to his feet. He dashed across the yard, scaled the prison wall, like a cat, in the words of one witness, and then ran down to a nearby river, kicked off his shoes and swam across. The jailer, Mr. Rickaby, grabbed his revolver. Then he and the prison surgeon, Dr. O'Carroll, gave chase.
Mr. Rickaby fired 2 barrels of his revolver on hearing which the prisoner looked around. Dr. O'Carroll then got possession of the revolver and also had a shot to intimidate him. But the prisoner continued on. It is reported that at this stage, a small dog belonging to someone connected with the jail became so excited through the commotion going on that he bit Dr. O'Carroll in the leg.
Honestly, this whole story would make for a great slapstick film. Maybe we'll get to make a Black Sheep TV show one day. Anyway, Robert Wallath didn't get far. A couple of farm workers heard the shots and caught the sopping wet, exhausted young man a few minutes later. He was taken back to jail and clapped in leg irons to stop him escaping again. Robert Wallath seems to have finally cottoned on to how serious this all was and the consequences he now faced. He talked to his dad and got a lawyer. At the Supreme Court, that lawyer, Mr. Weston, pleaded for leniency. He pointed out that Robert had not actually stolen much of value, mostly just loose change, a few boxes of cigars and bottles of booze, and much of what he'd taken was eventually returned. So, no harm, no foul.
In conclusion, Mr. Weston intimated that he had in his hand specimens of the class of literature that the prisoner had been in the habit of reading, such as The Adventures of Gentleman George and other similar works. His Honour said that he had no doubt, but that the prisoner's mind had been perverted by such books.
Mr. Weston painted Robert Wallath as a promising young man who'd been led astray by trashy novels. He said the shot fired at Harold Thompson was an accident. Robert never meant to hurt anyone. He was just playing a game, having some fun, you know. Boys will be boys. But Justice E.T. Connolly wasn't buying it. he noted it was pure luck that Robert hadn't killed Harold Thompson. If that had happened, he would have been convicted of murder, not just inflicting grievous bodily harm.
His Honour then sentenced the prisoner to 8 years penal servitude on the first charge and 3 years imprisonment with hard labour on the charge of demanding money by threats, sentences to be concurrent. Wallath was then removed, sobbing bitterly.
But then, something remarkable happened. The New Plymouth community came together and campaigned for Robert's release. It started literally the day after his sentencing. There was an editorial in the Taranaki Herald which compared Wallath's penalty to that of 2 other young men convicted of cattle rustling the same day.
Wallath committed his crimes more for the sake of notoriety than gain, his mind being perverted by reading a class of books of a pernicious nature. The cattle stealers, however, had been raiding their districts for months, driving animals from farmers' homesteads in a wholesale plunder and selling them. Wallath, for his crime, was sentenced to 8 years penal servitude, the cattle stealers to only 2 years imprisonment. As we have said, the sentences do not appear to us to be at all proportionate.
Over the next few years, Robert Wallath's family and friends organised 3 petitions asking for his sentence to be remitted. Some were even signed by his victims, including the hotel keeper at the Criterion, Mary Cottier. 4.5 years after his conviction, they finally succeeded. Robert was released and returned to New Plymouth.
It seemed somewhat strange to be home again. And one of the first things I had to decide soon after this was whether to go away to a fresh place to start life over again or remain here. The question was put by my father and some very sincere friends, and they said that in either case I was still the same to them. So, after seeking counsel from my Lord in the matter, I was led by the Spirit to see clearly the way, and I said, "Here I have fallen, and here I rise again." I was to live a very quiet life and to study much and to repay my dad and others in a way by being very attentive to the work of being a carpenter in Dad's business.
Within 2 years, Robert Wallath had settled down and married a woman called Ada West. They raised 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. Everyone still told the story of Robert's antics as a teenage highwayman, but he also gained a reputation as an honest, hard-working carpenter and a generous and pious man. In some ways, Robert Wallath's actions are actually more understandable from our modern perspective than in his own time. Back in the 1890s, that stereotype of a teenage rebel hadn't really been born yet. That's something which came out of American movies and comics in the 1950s. In 1959, just a year before his death, Robert Wallath published his memoir, A Highwayman with a Mission, hoping his story could act as a warning and inspiration for other wayward young men. In its final chapter, he wrote this:
I am now well on in my 75th year, and feel that I ought to take a glance backwards as well as forwards. From a man's point of view, there is no doubt I was a young fool, even very much so, and would certainly say to young folk especially, it does not pay to go down that road, regardless of what Satan might promise. But of those days, I will not comment much just now, for I can scarcely understand them myself. much less explain them.
Thanks for listening, and special thanks to my guest Megan Wells from Pukeariki Museum. We'll be back in your feed next week, so make sure to follow and listen to Black Sheep wherever you find your podcasts. You can also visit our website, rnz.co.nz, to find lots more entertaining, enthralling, occasionally harrowing stories from New Zealand history. Black Sheep is written and presented by me, William Ray. Our sound engineer is Mark Chesterman, our production coordinator is Brianna Juritich, and the executive producer is Tim Watkin. Mā te wā.